Good morning. Welcome to the Institute for Critical Study of Society, ICSS Sunday morning digital platform program. My name is Raj Sahai, who along with 7 other members of the program committee organize our programs, and many of those members are here today. The Institute for the Critical Study of Society at Nebel Proctor Marxist Library was formed in 2004 to preserve Marx's heritage, as well as supporting emerging struggles for racial and gender equality and for socialism, because we believe socialism is the only real solution for social justice. The opinions expressed in our lectures, workshops, publications are those of their authors only and do not necessarily represent ICSS or Nebel Proctor Marxist Library consensus. We are united, however, in our respect for Karl Marx, who in his 11th thesis on Feuerbach said, philosophers have described the world in different ways. The point, however, is to change it. That is what motivates us. It is obvious that the world needs changing, so our work is ahead of us. Today's subject is on Sykes-Picot and other secret and not so secret agreements and that were held during World War I between colonizing powers, Britain and France, supported by Imperial Russia, for the dismemberment of the Ottoman Empire. The Sykes-Picot Agreement is the specific one that led to the division of Turkish-held Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, and Palestine into various French and British-administered areas. Our guest speaker today is historian Mark Albertson, who will talk to us on the process that has culminated in this tragedy called Israel-Palestine conflict, and today in the mass deaths and misery in Gaza. Mark Albertson is the historical research editor at the Army Aviation magazine in Monroe, Connecticut, from where he's joining us, and is the historian for the Army Aviation Association of America. He has authored several books: USS Connecticut, Constitution State Battleship, that's one of them. They'll have to follow you, that's the second one. The Triumph of the Great White Fleet, that's the third one. On History, a Treatise, that's the fourth one. And there are others. He has also published articles on a variety of newspapers and magazines. Mark teaches history as an adjunct at Norwalk Community College in Norwalk, Connecticut, and he's been our guest speaker several times, very exciting guest speaker. He'll speak for about 50 minutes, and following a brief intermission for announcements, he will answer questions and respond to comments. Please join me in welcoming Mark Albertson. It's all yours, Mark.
Okay, thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you happen to be. It's after 1:30 where I am, so wherever you are, good afternoon, good day, and thank you for tuning in. This is what you're seeing today is a continuation of something that's been going on for quite a long time. It's probably the world's upset stomach for decades and decades, and there doesn't seem to be any Pepto-Bismol of humanity that's going to solve this problem. So don't expect the United States to solve this problem, because the British didn't solve this problem. We're from the West. But the ultimate schemer here are the British. They were the consummate schemer, and at one point had the world's grandest empire. And they began to insinuate themselves here going back to at least 1622, when they began open relations with Persia to kick out the Portuguese. And with the formation of, and this is only 21 years after the British East India Company was formed, and that British East India Company got itself involved in India in 1613. And so what you're seeing here in modern parlance is really a corporate foreign policy developing here. This is going to become a monolithic company. I mean, the French are going to have a company like this, the Dutch, so on and so forth. They're all going to have companies like this. But the British East India Company will, one of the turning points here is the 7 Years' War. I mean, so we're into the 18th century here. And with the 7 Years' War, this is which Churchill called the world's first world war. Now, you can make cases against that, but I'm not going to argue with Churchill here. Sometimes that's a losing proposition. But it was fought on two continents. It was fought in North America and it was fought in India. And the British are trying to gain total control of India. Yet in 1763, when the 7 Years' War is over with, the British are becoming very concerned with Tsarist Russia. I mean, Tsarist Russia is moving on the world's largest landmass. I mean, how many time zones you got here? And they're moving north, south, east, west, and they're controlling the Black Sea. Well, to British planners, it's only a matter of time before they come down the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, get into the Persian Gulf through the Strait of Hormuz, and you're into the Arabian Sea. Hence, here's colonial India. And so they are going to begin to move that Indian Empire west. The British East India Company will open up an office in Basra, in that southeast corner of Iraq today. And then they'll be followed 5 years later by a British consulate. They will open up another office here in 1798 in Baghdad, followed by another British consulate here in 1802. Now, keep in mind, Napoleon invaded Egypt and the Levant in 1798 in an effort to divert attention from the French Revolutionary War going on in Europe. Yet the French will be kicked out of here by 1802, the Treaty of Paris, June 25, 1802. And what the French did is to bring something here, and I find this fascinating, is to bring something here that upon pain of death by the Ottomans, you weren't allowed to have, and that was the printing press. It becomes like a 19th century internet. People are getting tennis elbows printing up all different ideas. And so they also bring the ideas of the age of reason, age of enlightenment here. Liberalism, democracy, republicanism, secularism, socialism, nationalism, parliamentarianism. And these ideas are spreading the same time, not only in Europe, but now through that place we call the Middle East. But the Ottomans are already tottering. They had been in a 100-year conflict on and off with the Safavid Persians in the 16th and 17th centuries, fighting over Mesopotamia, later to become what we call Iraq. And finally, it's Murad IV, the Sultan, in 1638 that wins this long battle. And they'll hold on to Mesopotamia till 1918. But what happens to a country or a power when it's been fighting on and off for 100 years? Sometimes they get a little weak, and that's how the British see them in the 18th century. So we have to motivate them, and they begin to move in here, moving their Indian Empire west because they don't want Tsarist Russia coming in. And so here, by well into the 19th century, as the British are insinuating themselves, you know what they wanted to do at one point? Bring in 2 million Indians to work in textile factories, calling them pioneers. I mean, these are some of the outlandish ideas they had to bring additional power here or take additional control here. However, one of the big developments in 1853 happens when the Russians move into parts of Romania. Remember, Romania was part of the Ottoman Empire. And they move into Romania, not all of it, but part of it. Well, Napoleon III, who's trying to resurrect France as a great power, he's going to help the Ottomans here. Well, the British, not wanting the British not only don't trust the Russians, they don't trust the French. And so they're going to join the French and the Ottomans in fighting the Russians. This is called the Crimean War. This is an important war. It's not really given attention anymore. I mean, there's a lot more going on with this war than Errol Flynn and Nigel Bruce charging up the Balaclava Heights for Michael Curtiz in 1936. This war cost 500,000 men. And the only reason it really didn't become a great war is because with the Holy Alliance, Russia had an alliance here in 1818 with Prussia and the Austrians. The last two chose not to take part, so the Russians lose. However, you know, you are at the same time here, the cast of characters is changing among that cast of imperialist powers. You know, you're getting into now the latter part of the 19th century. The Spanish, the Portuguese, and the Dutch are becoming non-starters. You're seeing new blood come in here. The Italians, they want to become a colonial power. The Germans, which will be a competitor to the British, they want to be in this club. Another one, although it's not white, Christian, and European. Now you're beginning to get the outsiders. Japan coming on. And of course, with the Spanish-American War, the United States. The United States is of note here because in 1865, the real cause of the American Civil War, not slavery, it was the difference between the Jeffersonian notion of this country and the Hamiltonian notion, and it's the Hamiltonian notion that finally wins and turns America into this monolithic industrialized state. And this is going to be a problem for the British, because in the end of the 19th century, the United States has knocked the British off as the number one industrial power. You're beginning to see something else happen here because Otto von Bismarck is no longer the German chancellor, and treaties between Germany, Austria, and Russia are not continued under Kaiser Wilhelm II. France and Russia now sign an alliance in 1904. With the rise of America coming after the Spanish-American War on the world stage as an imperialist power, in 1899-1900, the British are not doing well in the Boer War. You see, there's cracks beginning to come here in this edifice of the British Empire, and the French as well. However, interestingly enough, in 1903, and again the Germans are coming on here, they win a concession from the Ottomans for building a railroad from Baghdad into the Middle East. Now, again here in 1904, the British are going to have to compromise, and they compromise with the French. And they form an alliance with the French in 1904, also to stave off the oncoming German Navy and the oncoming monolithic German corporate state. And they form an alliance. They come to an agreement here. The French will observe English primacy or British primacy in Egypt. At the same time, the British will observe a French primacy in Morocco. They will allow the French unfettered access through Gibraltar, and the French will not impede at all, because keep in mind, at one point, they are both operating the Suez Canal. They will allow the British free access, and eventually to the British to control the Suez Canal, which is okay, because in 1901, the British rather, with the Qajar Shah dynasty in Persia, got the concession to drill for oil, which they're going to hit here in 1909. And that brings another aspect to what we're talking about in the Middle East, oil. Big navies now, especially the United States, which is coming on, and the Royal Navy is going from coal to oil. That's big. That's huge. And in 1907, the British, who never wanted the Russians to come in, will split Persia with the Russians. In other words, the Qajar Shah dynasty was being overthrown by more progressive elements in Persia, looking to advance the ideals, get this, of the Age of Reason, Age of Enlightenment. The British don't want that. Tsarist Russia doesn't want that, because they put down Georgy Gapon's movement here at the Winter Palace in 1905. You know, where the people wanted a better deal in Russia. They don't want this developing on their southern border, so they get together with the British and they divide up Persia. This is a mirror of what the Soviet Union and the British are going to do again to Iran in August of 1941. But here, the British are now pumping the oil out because they need that oil. However, at the same time, nationalism, one of the big isms coming out of the Age of Reason, Age of Enlightenment, has affected the Arabs, and they want out of the Ottoman Empire, just like many Arabs do. They don't want to be members of the Ottoman Empire. And so in 1904, the Arabs are going to petition the British in February. Abdullah, the son of King Hussein in the Hejaz, he's the keeper of the keys here. He oversees Medina and Mecca. He's a Hashemite, and he is a direct descendant of Muhammad. His son will, because they're all Arab nationalists here, they want that divorce from the Ottomans. He will petition the British in February and again in April 1914. And they want help from the British to throw off the Ottoman yoke and create an Arab state. Now get this, an Arab state. The British will say no. Now they're contacting here Lord Kitchener, and they're actually going through a go-between named Ronald Storrs. He's an advisor to Kitchener, but the British say no. However, June 28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand and the Countess Sophie are assassinated in Sarajevo. The big powers tumble into what we call the First World War. Although anyone that's heard my talks before, no, I don't believe in World War I and World War II. There's only one war. It started in 1914 and it's over in 1945. It's a 31-year conflict on and off. But be it as it may, now all these big countries in Europe go to war. However, Italy's of note here because they were part of the Triple Alliance, part of the Central Powers with the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Germans. Having said that, they back out. Now, don't think the Italians are cavalier people. They backed out because the Brits and the French promised them more territory after the war is over with. So who joins the Central Powers to round off the threesome? The Ottomans do. That's when the British will contact the Arab nationalists. We will now help you with your Arab nationalism. And so this begins in 1915. What's going to be known as the Hussein-McMahan Correspondence. King Hussein and Henry McMahon, who is now the High Commissioner in Egypt, begin a correspondence. He represents the British government here on Arab nationalism. How do we discuss this Arab nationalism? How far do we go with Arab nationalism? How much do we give them towards Arab nationalism? And the Arabs, get what the Arabs want here. This is known to history as the Damascus Protocol. It actually came out May 23, 1915. And it's presented by Faisal bin Hussein. And it's pushed by Al Fatah, which is an Arab, by the way, nationalist movement, as well as Al Ant, which are Iraqi nationalists, but they're also officers in the Ottoman army who want Arab independence. Now, it's interesting, the groupings here, but this Damascus Protocol, if this had been pulled off, would have gone from what you call Palestine and Lebanon on the Mediterranean Sea all the way out to the Indian Ocean. There would have been no Gulf states or Saudi Arabia. It would have gone from the Red Sea to the Persian Gulf. That's a huge slice of territory here for a single group of people. Now, do you honestly think the British and the French are going to go with this? No, they're not. And so while Hussein and McMahon are corresponding here, what begins in 1916 between Mark Sykes of the British Foreign Ministry and Sykes-Picot of the French Foreign Ministry, they begin to negotiate here for drawing borders in the Middle East. Now, they're also going to include here Tsarist Russia. Get a load of this. Tsarist Russia. They begin to draw borders. Now, keep in mind, the Ottomans hadn't really drawn borders here. Yeah, they had administrative districts, vilayets they were called. I mean, you would have an administrative district in Baghdad, perhaps in Mosul, Damascus, Beirut. These were administrative districts because, the Turks aren't stupid. They live in the area. They're also Muslims, and they know many of these people are nomads. They float the desert. Many had been floating the desert for centuries. They didn't need borders. They knew how far they could go before they infringed on someone else's territory. They don't need borders. What you're seeing develop here is a Western-style settlement. And they begin to draw borders through clannish associations, tribal affiliations, religious differences, and ethnic passions. And you don't think you're not going to have a problem here? And so you never would have had a Palestine. You're going to have one now. Now, Palestine is interesting. It's going to be, get this, a condominium. The French would occupy the northern part. The Tsarist Russia was actually given a midriff. The British will occupy the south. Now, why is that? Because if you take a look at a map, that's the closest portion of the Suez Canal. And the British aren't sharing that with anybody because the oil from Persia is going through the Suez Canal. And so you'll be able to see later on Syria, Lebanon. Now, interesting with regards to what they're going to call Iraq. At one point, Mosul was considered part of Turkey or Syria. The French were actually going to control this. Now, the British, being the ultimate schemers here, are going to use the French as a buffer to Tsarist Russia. You're not going to have a Turkey here. That's not going to exist. Well, if the Ottoman Empire collapses, what are the Turks going to do, right? However, there's also something else coming up here. In 1917, the Zionists want a separate state, and the British are going to try to help give them one. Now, the Arabs don't know anything about this. The Arabs don't know anything about the Sykes-Picot Agreement. But then again, neither do the Zionists. And let's understand something here. But even by 1900, there were already 40,000 Jewish immigrants in Palestine, coming out of Eastern and Central Europe. By 1914-18, there's about 85,000. But now it's becoming policy. And on November 2nd, 1917, the Balfour Declaration. If you haven't read it, it only take you 30 seconds. Yeah, part of the Balfour Declaration here, the immigrants coming in will not at all impede the social and religious aspects of the indigenous already living here. Now, this is along the line, I always say it's along the line of the Budapest Memorandum of December 5, 1994, when the Ukrainians agreed to give up all their nuclear weapons. And with this Budapest Memorandum, it was not only signed by Ukraine, it was signed by the United States, it was signed by the United Kingdom, and it was signed by the Russian Federation. And get this, that they would recognize, understand this, recognize Ukrainian independence, Ukrainian territorial integrity, and Ukrainian political structures. What's happened with that since 1994? Okay, what's happened here in Palestine since 1917? You see what I mean here? So when you look at the signatures of the great powers, they're really not worth the paper they're printed on. However, having said that, the Bolsheviks. Now, this is interesting because this brings in a new faction here. The Tsar is out. The Russian Revolution, the Tsar is out. And in November of 1917, the Bolsheviks are going through Tsarist files. And they find references here to the Sykes-Picot Agreement. And they are going to make this public on November 23rd in Investia and Pravda, 1917. Now everyone's got egg on their face. I'm talking about the British and the French. However, the Guardian, remember the British newspaper Guardian? They also made it public on the 26th. You might as well, the cat's out of the bag. And the French are kind of are really kind of nervous here. Well, you know how the British are. Take it easy. The stiff upper lip, take it easy. We'll get through this. And they announce, and the French sign on, that they are going to adhere to pushing for Arab independence. They haven't renounced this. However, 1918, the war on the Western Front is winding down here. And actually, over a week and a half before the armistice, November 11, 1918, when they stopped shooting on the Western Front, on October 30, 1918, the armistice at Mudros. The Ottomans actually gave up the fighting before the Germans did, and the Austro-Hungarians. Turkey has to demobilize with this armistice. Garrisons will surrender and go into the stockades. Turkish ports, railways, and other strategic points will now be overseen by the Allies. And Turkey now, or Anatolia, the Turks, now have to go back to the pre-war borders and evacuate the Middle East. Now, interesting, in 1919, this is going to be followed by the Versailles Treaty. And the British and the French are going to get the mandates, and let's understand something else. Since now Lenin has taken control of Russia, they are cut out of that condominium in Palestine. They are cut out. In fact, when they were redoing the borders again, at one point, the British are going to make sure that Mosul, in that northeast section, will now be applied to Iraq. The French are going to get Syria and Lebanon. Palestine is going to go to the British. But what about Anatolia? A lot of Anatolia at one point will be occupied by the French. The British are using them as a buffer to now Bolshevik Russia. But that's not the end of this. It's going to change again. However, people, and who's not a fan of this? And I don't think you'll be surprised, Lawrence of Arabia. In fact, he goes with Faisal to Versailles. Just like Ho Chi Minh went to Versailles, believing in Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, people will be able to determine their own fate here? No, Southeast Asia is going to remain with the tender mercies of the French. And now, no, the Arabs are not going to get a proper airing here at Versailles because the Sykes-Picot Agreement has virtually made it imperative that the British and the French are going to keep control of the Middle East because of their colonial aspirations. Now, this is especially important because of what happened here in 1914, 1918. You are beginning to see the economic downturn here of the Europeans as the global determinants of power and the rise of another country coming up here. Guess who that is? You live in it. It's called the United States. The French in particular want to keep their colonies. Let's understand something. In this war, and Lenin was right. Lenin was absolutely right. This war, when it was fought, was an industrialized war. Also, by the way, the British and French will not give up their colonies, and they're not going to. Why? Because they need those resources from these colonies to rebuild their economies after this war. That's why they're doing this in the first place. But keep in mind at the San Remo Conference on April 1926, 1920, you know who was one of the participants here? You might find this surprising. Britain, France, Italy, Japan. Now, are the Japanese getting anything out of the Middle East? No, but because they were a dutiful ally and coming on as this important power, they are included here. The Japanese aspirations are not in the Middle East. The Japanese aspirations are in the Pacific because for being a dutiful ally, they got a lot of the German holdings in the Pacific, which I'm sure gives you a better idea as to why it's going to cost a number of GI Marine lives to kick them off those islands in 42 to 45 here. But with the San Remo Conference, the mandates are parceled out. Iraq goes to the British. Palestine to the British. Syria to the British. Lebanon to the British. And so you're beginning to see now the demarcation lines now begin to matter here. However, the Arab nationalists still proclaim a state. You know, the Arab nationalists in Syria are going to rise up here. They're going to be crushed by the summer of 1920. You will see here, you will see Sunnis, Shias, and Kurds drop their differences in this newly minted Iraq and rise up to throw out the British. They'll get crushed, 1921. But you see something else develop here. Arabs in Palestine, they begin to rise up. You know, I found this fascinating because of the fact that why the Balfour Declaration anyway? Let's understand something here. The British reasoning for this. Number one, this is one way to get rid of Jewish people in Europe. All right, let's understand this. Number two, they came up with this in 1917 because there were upwards of 100,000 German Jewish men fighting for the German army in World War I. So let's promise them something the Kaiser's not going to promise them, a homeland. Number three, this is one way to appeal to wealthy Jewish citizens in the United States, perhaps getting a few bucks here. But the big one here is number four. They are putting together a colonial outpost for the West, is what they're doing. Jewish people from Europe, they're Europeans. They're not born here. They're Europeans. They are European imports. This is an outpost for the West. You know, there are many Arabs here, it seems, who understand this. Maybe we don't here, but they do. And so do you know at some point some in the British Foreign Office, I mean, talk about naivete, thought that these people, these Jewish immigrants coming in from Europe, could also be power brokers here between the people who live here and the Europeans. How's that going to work? Number one, they're not interested in doing that at all. They're interested in consolidating their holds is what they're doing here. And so in 1920, you see the Arabs rise up here, and the British have to put it down here too. This is not a friendly area here. But there's also one more here, Turkey. Turkey, as you see it, was not supposed to exist. And so here you're seeing the Greeks, the Italians, the British, and the French carve up the Anatolian homeland. This is a 20th century crusade. The Greeks in the end are going to get the West Coast, Izmir. The French, or the Italians rather, pardon me, the Italians will get the southern portion of Turkey out to the holdings of the French. Approximately the middle of the southern part of Turkey, also bordered after that by the British. There will also be a truncated Kurdistan and also the Armenians in the northeast section. Now there's going to be an Armenian homeland here, which by the way will mate itself up with the Armenians who formed an independent republic in the Caucasus, because when Tsarist Russia fell apart, they lost the Caucasus. Lenin wants it back. So Kemal Ataturk is going to put an army together. This is called the Turkish War for Independence, 1919, 1922. And then they're going to, in the end, they're going to throw out the Italians, the Greeks, the British, and the French. And Kemal Ataturk made a deal with Lenin. You dispense with the Armenian Republic on your side of the border in the Caucasus. We'll dispense with the Armenian side of the Republic on our side of the border. And they do. It's wiped off the map. This is the beginning of what you're going to see countries coming out of the settlement here of Versailles. The Armenians, you could say, are the first. Czechoslovakia will be wiped out by March 1939, and Poland will be wiped off the map as an independent state by October 5, 1939. So much for the Versailles Treaty. But here you see a treaty come up here, the Treaty of Lausanne, which comes out in 1923. The Middle East generally, as you see it today, is the result of that treaty. And Turkey will be an independent state. But they're Turks, they're not Arabs. The only Arab state made by Arabs by 1932 is Saudi Arabia, put together by Abdul Aziz ibn Saud. And the British will make sure he will, he has a coast on the Red Sea. Abdul Aziz ibn Saud wanted a coast on the Persian Gulf. The British will not allow him to do that, and they create what you call the Gulf states. But now you're beginning to see, as more and more people coming out of Eastern and Central Europe beginning to settle here in Palestine, there's going to be a problem here by 1936. Another Arab revolt, only this one's going to last 3 years. This is going to be an issue for Jewish people getting to Palestine, because the British now are going to have to cater, after they crack down on them, they're going to have to cater to the Arabs. They're a referee here. And it couldn't have come at a worse time for Jewish people in Europe who can't get out of Eastern and Central Europe. The British come up with a white paper. Now, as of 1939, only 15,000 Jewish people per year will be allowed to come out of Europe to settle into Palestine. That means in 5 years, 75,000. Do you know the Jewish Agency was working with Reinhard Heydrich in 1939 in Berlin to get Jewish people out of Germany and into Palestine. But once Hitler invades Poland on September 1, 1939, that office of the Jewish Agency is going to close down because the British had already, mind you, increased air patrols and sea patrols around Palestine and are stopping ships from Europe getting into Palestine. And you know what's going to happen to Jewish people in Europe here, the final solution. However, once you get to 1945, though, the global dynamics of power are changing here. The British Empire is collapsing. The French Empire is collapsing. Who's the big winner of what you call the Second World War? It's the United States. And on Valentine's Day, 1945, Franklin D. Roosevelt, just before he dies, makes the deal on board the heavy cruiser Quincy off Bitter Lakes, Egypt, and the two make the deal. U.S. military protection for the kingdom versus preferential access to Saudi crude, and every president, be he Democrat and Republican, has catered to this agenda ever since. You, by the way, as American citizens, have now taken control of the British Empire. Your job since 1945 is two things. Number one, make sure the dollar remains the world's reserve currency. And number two, make sure, by the way, that the resources go west, not east. And of course, the antagonist here is the Soviet Union. However, that's going to change in 1991 when the Soviet Union collapses, leaving the United States as the sole superpower. Having said that, that's not going to last all that long, because now by the 21st century, you now live in a multipolar world. But let's understand something. Israel is an imperialist satrap for the United States, just like it was an imperialist satrap for the British, even before it became an official state known as Israel. The war you're seeing today is reflective of that. We are going to support the Israelis till the cows come home, just like we are supporting the Ukrainians till the cows come home, and you have to add them here. Why? It's resources. It's still part of the great game, and it's still being played. Only now it's not the Spanish, the Portuguese, the Dutch, Tsarist Russia, the British, and the French. It is now the United States, the Russian Federation, the EU, China, India, and let's not leave the Japanese out, because they got to beg, borrow, and steal oil wherever they can get it. But right now, the game is played. The two major antagonists in this game are the United States and China. They are the two big powers here. And the United States, that army in Ukraine right now is your army. The material we're sending them is for them to use to fight the Russians. And we are going to fight this down to the last Russian, and the Chinese will fight this down to the last, we'll fight this down to the last Ukrainian. The Chinese are going to fight this down to the last Russian, just like what you're seeing in the Middle East. we're going to fight this down to the last Israeli. And it's interesting here because that means Israelis too are being used as pawns in a game larger than themselves. They were used by the British. They're being used by us. Now, one of the major reasons here is, yes, we need them to remain viable as that platform or outpost for the West. But at the same time, and let's understand this, one of the reasons these Palestinians are going to be moved or they're going to try to move them is that there's trillions of cubic feet of natural gas off Palestine and off Lebanon. You don't think the West does not want to get control of that? If you don't believe that, you're dreaming. It's always the resources. It's always the money. It's the same script. It's just different cast of characters. It's called the Great Game. And part of what you saw here with the Hussein-McMahan Correspondence, the Damascus Protocol, the Sykes-Picot Agreement, the Balfour Declaration, the Treaty, the Armistice at Mudros, the Treaty of Sevres, the San Remo Conference, and finally the Treaty of Lausanne. These are all steps in this game. It's the same dirt. The great powers just changed the borders, and the people who live within these borders don't matter. Interesting game. Anybody has any questions or comments? It's quarter after. I've been on 45 minutes, I think. And I think maybe we ought to open it up.
That's fine, Bart. Thank you very much. Very exciting presentation. So we're going to have some announcements here. First of all, what's coming up? Artificial intelligence, cure or disease. The speaker is going to be Özgür Narin. He's an academic from Turkey. And on June 9th, the ideology of the Cold War, origin and evolution. And the speaker is Matthew Eret. June 16 is the Indian parliamentary elections, which are ongoing, and democracy or fascism. So that will be my report on what's going on. And then you can see on our website, ICSSmarks.org, for upcoming programs. There are many other exciting programs coming afterwards, including Rise of Fascism in the United States with a question mark. So those are the things upcoming now. I would say that at this point, let me set up the rule for next hour. We will get, if you want to raise a question, raise your hand. And the way to do it here is you go into, on my screen, it's called More, and then there is a button called Reactions. And when you go to push that reaction, it gives you raise hands. So when you push that, I will see a symbol. And I try to follow in sequence, but if I don't follow in sequence, please don't get disturbed. I'll get to everybody. So you can raise hands. You can raise hands from now onwards. And then one other set of rule is that it's any question or comment person is speaking gets 2 minutes. And I'll ask Mehmet to please keep time and let me know if a person is going much beyond 2 minutes, and if we'll give them a warning to wrap up. If not, we'll eject that person, because you have to the other rule is you have to not give a speech. You can make short comment, but also be not disagreeable. This is a community forum. You can totally disagree with the other person, including our speaker, but do not use language that infringes on another person's dignity. So that having been said, we are open for questions. I think Mark is always ready for a question. Mark, so let's see. I saw a hand, but then I don't see it. Maybe I can start the session by asking. Okay, yeah, Jean is there, and Richard Wright and Janet Coburn, sorry. So Jean, followed by Richard, followed by Janet. Please go ahead, Jean. Unmute yourself.
And unmuting myself. Well, Mark, thanks for such a great talk. I mean, I'm just kind of in awe and trying to put it all together because there's so much there to deal with, and you know,
there sure is.
and you seem to have control of it all, which I'm just amazed by. But you did one of the couple of things that you said. One was that you know, the inhabitants of that country of the Middle East did not really determine what the boundaries were. That these were determined by outside forces.
Right.
And I think that, you know, as you say, that really underlies a lot of what's going on there. But the other thing, and correct me on this, but my understanding is that during the period when the Middle East was under the control of the Ottoman Empire, you know, the Ottomans were more or less equal opportunity oppressors, and that the Jews, Muslims, and Christians did not really have a chat. They got along. They didn't fight each other. Maybe there were problems, but they weren't killing each other in the way we see now. And is my understanding true? Is that, you know, did Jews, Muslims, and Christians get along before the modern period, the Balfour Declaration, and all that? And how do you see this playing out? What's the end game here?
Yeah, there was a period. That's a good question. There was a period, Gene, where the Ottomans were putting the pressure on people like the Christians and Jewish people to become Muslim, become Ottomans, you know, become Muslim. Now, that's not what Muhammad would have done. You know, when Muhammad created the Ummah here, you know, if you wanted to convert, you could. If you didn't, you just paid a jizya or a tax, but you're still part of the Ummah. You could be a pagan for all I care, as long as you're part of the Ummah. But you know what, Gene? You're seeing the same thing in the papal states in the 19th century when the papal goon squads would go out and kidnap Jewish children and forcibly raise them as Christian. You know, so but with the Ottomans, it's going to change after the Crimean War, because of the fact the British and the French helped the Ottomans, and it shows you the growing weakness of the Ottomans. They have to give Christians in particular, Protestants and Catholics, more of a better deal here in the Middle East. And the Ottomans are going to have to accede to this. So it's interesting here. It's interesting here how the British and the French affected this after the Crimean War. And then one more point, the Ottomans too were trying to raise the specter of Ottomanism. You know, they know these people want to separate. They know all these ethnicities want to separate from the Ottoman Empire. So they want them to become Ottomans, Ottomanism. And they're going to try to make everybody a citizen here. It's too late. It's not going to work. It's not going to work. In fact, they were even going to tax some of the tribal sheikhs here. Well, some of the tribal sheikhs are going to sell their land to other sheikhs. Of course, that's going to lead to a consolidation of power here land-wise a little bit, but they're also selling land to people from outside the Middle East. Some of these people in 1848, 1858 are going to be Jewish people escaping Eastern and Central Europe. Now, how do you think this is going to be to people who have lived in Palestine all their lives? Yeah, I can't buy this land, but they're selling it to outsiders from Europe. So maybe the seeds for this is not 1848, maybe not 1918 or 1916. Let's go back to 1848. You know, I mean, these things effervesce quite a while. And so this frustration is going to build and finally explode. It's only a matter of time. It's only a matter of time. People are only going to take so much. So,
well, again, and then what's the end game here? I mean, we're calling for a ceasefire, but what comes after that?
yeah, precisely.
Is there a solution?
Well, to me, there's already a two-state solution here. It's been in vogue here for decades. It's the civilian army for the Israelis and the Israeli army for the Palestinians. There's your two-state solution. That's your two-state solution. And I don't think the Israelis are going to give that up. I don't think they are. I don't think they are. So, you know.
Okay. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.
I'm going to go.
You're
Yeah.
welcome, Gene. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to go to Richard Wright, who's and then followed by Janet Coburn. I'd seen Elazar raise his hand, but I don't see him now for some reason. So go ahead, Richard, and then Janet will follow Richard.
Hi, Mark.
Hello, Richard.
Good to see you again, as usual.
Good to see you there, sir.
And we're trying to liberate the Oblast here.
Yeah, the independent fascist state of Texas.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. There are a couple of things that you first off, could you spell out that final treaty? Could you put it in the chat, the final treaty that you mentioned?
Oh, the Treaty of Lausanne.
Yeah,
1923.
I tried to look it up and I didn't spell it right. Anyways, but the thing and this is sort of off topic, although to me I'm kind of intrigued by it. You mentioned that the Japanese had a seat at the table for the what was the World War II, the Versailles Treaty of Versailles.
Well, they were at Versailles, and they were also at the San Remo Conference too in April of 1920.
So you mentioned that they were interested in the German holdings in the Indonesian area, I assume is what they were interested in.
Well, they're getting many of the German holdings, like in the Marianas, New Guinea, so on and so forth.
First off, how did the Germans end up over there? You know, I mean, you understand the Spanish and the English,
Right.
but how did I mean, I've never heard of the Germans being involved.
Oh yeah, Otto von Bismarck was not a fan of colonialism. He was not a fan, but there was a lot of pressure on him to accede to this. And he wouldn't until really Kaiser Wilhelm II, canned him in 1890, and is going to go on to make every mistake Bismarck said Germany shouldn't make. But that's beside the point. And in fact, in 1898, they wanted the Philippines. And after we took the Philippines, Admiral Dewey, and Admiral Dietrichs of the German Navy showed up in Manila Bay. And you know what the United States is going to tell him? Admiral Dewey's going to tell him either get out or shoot it out.
Yeah, sure.
And he left. However, interestingly enough, the Japanese and the British would rather the United States take the Philippines and not the Germans, because at this time, the Japanese are an ally of the British.
Okay.
Because the British trained and helped build the Imperial Japanese Navy. So it's interesting the political makeup here. But because the Japanese were such a dutiful ally, and they don't do a lot of fighting here, Richard. They'll do some fighting in the Pacific, but there's not really much fighting to talk about here, like in German possessions in China. They'll do a little fighting here. But what I find fascinating, Richard, is that by the time this war is, in fact, someone put it here. The Kim White says in the chat, Lenin called the Sykes-Picot Treaty the agreement of the colonial thieves. That's a pretty good way of looking at it. But they're thieves anyway. And so you see here, it's going to cost the British 965,000 dead by 1918 to keep her empire. It's going to cost the British 1,565,000 dead and to keep her empire. It's going to cost the Germans 1,770,000 dead, and they lost their empire. You know what it cost the Japanese to get some of those possessions in the Pacific? 300 or 400 dead. If you're into this, who comes out here smelling like a rose? The Japanese.
Yeah.
The Japanese. And so they're on their way, Richard, to becoming a determinative power. And so the cast of characters, the game is still being played here, Richard, but the cast of characters is now being altered a little bit. You know, they're not just Anglo-Saxons anymore or white Christian people from Europe. Now we're getting round heads, slanted eyes, and yellow skin. You know, some of these Europeans are thinking, there goes the neighborhood.
So
But it's changing. It's
a
changing.
quick follow-up, if I could.
Yeah.
Presumably, one of the resources the Japanese were after was the petroleum. But what were the other resources that they were there iron? I mean, what did the German holdings consist of?
Well, the Japanese are resource poor.
Right, I understand, sure.
They're resource poor. And so when they got Korea in 1905 from the Russians, you know, that was a knife blade pointed at the heart of Japan. But now it's a jump off point. And by 1931, they're going to invade Manchuria. And they're going to get coal, iron ore, manganese, which is something they need.
Right.
And then, of course, when they attacked Pearl Harbor was not the #1 target in December. The #1 target was the Dutch East Indies, because then it was the world's 4th largest producer of crude.
Right.
And you don't have to drill the wells, Richard. The Dutch already did it for you. And they can turn it into a Japanese gas station.
Okay, thank you.
No, that's a great, no, it's a great point.
Okay, thank you. So next one is Janet, and then following Janet will be 2 others, Mario and then Norma Harrison. Okay, so Janet, please go ahead.
Hello, Janet.
Hi. Thank you for all this information and for all the work you've done on this. Lots of dates.
No, thank you for tuning in.
But I humbly request an extra minute to share some important information about the US, Zionism, and World War I that you did not touch on. Will that be okay?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Go ahead, Janet. Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah. To add to the list of the events Mark has presented, and my sources are mostly from Alison Weir's book, Against Our Better Judgment, I wanted to share some things about the role the US played in creating the State of Israel. First, in 1887, President Grover Cleveland began a 30-year precedent of appointing a Jewish ambassador to Turkey, the seat of the Ottoman Empire. Meanwhile, by the 1890s, what was to become the Zionist lobby had begun in the US. In 1912, Louis Brandeis became a Zionist, and in 1914, he became the head of the International Zionist Central Office. 2 years later, his appointment as a US Supreme Court justice by his close friend Woodrow Wilson was controversial because there were widespread accusations of unethical behavior by Brandeis. He secretly conducted extrajudicial political goals with the help of Felix Frankfurter, who he had recruited and who was to later become a Supreme Court justice himself in 1939.
Right.
Brandeis also became a leader of a secret society called Parushim, Parushim, that covertly pushed Zionism, which operated as a secret underground guerrilla force to quietly influence events. And although most Americans were opposed to the US entering World War I, and one of Woodrow Wilson's presidential campaign slogans in 1912 was, quote, "He kept us out of war," end quote. He had a change of heart from an initial position of neutrality of the US to entering the war in 1917. It was not a coincidence that this was the year of the Balfour Declaration, in which the Parushim and Brandeis's influence played a role. Britain and the Allies were losing the war against Germany and the Central Powers that included the Ottoman Empire. They needed the help of the US. I quote from Alison Weir's book, quote, diverse documentary evidence shows that Zionists pushed for the US to enter the war on Britain's side as part of a deal to gain British support for their colonization of Palestine, end quote. So I'll end there, but let me just also add that, in the 1920s, over 20,000 Ukrainians settled in Palestine to escape from the pogroms there.
Right.
Thank you, Janet. And any comment, Mark, on this?
Yeah, a lot of what you're saying here is true. However, and when you went to school, I'm sure you were told this when you went to history class, that unrestricted German submarine warfare is what got us into the First World War. Because, and truth be told here, Woodrow Wilson warned the Germans a number of times. Now, when the Germans ceased unrestricted submarine warfare and lost the Battle of Jutland, they went back to unrestricted submarine warfare. And Woodrow Wilson will go before Congress April 2nd, 1917, and ask for that declaration of war like presidents are supposed to do, and no longer do. And he got it 4 days later. However, there is a big shadow here in this. There's a big 800-pound gorilla in this room, and it's called money. You know, the Morgan interests were loaning money like it was going on. This is an industrialized, corporatized, commercialized war. You can't fight an industrialized war without two things, money and oil. Those are prerequisites. And so the Morgan interests, get this, the Morgan interests, as rich as they are, can no longer keep up with the British and French requirements. So in 1917, something's going to be passed here. It's called the Liberty Act. And for the first time in American history, you were going to see in this Liberty Act, which really becomes a corporate entity here, a governmental corporate entity, and the only taxpayer here, the only stockholder is the American taxpayer. And by the time the war is over with, we are going to have loaned the British and the French in particular $11.5 billion. You know how much money that is then? That's unheard of, unheard of. And we're going to want it back. And so in 1918, they need to send American troops over as fast as possible because Lenin kept his promise to the Russian people. He took Russia out of the war. Without that Russian army, we have to take up the slack with the Brits and the French, because believe it or not, if the Germans had won the war in 1918, if they had brought all those troops from the Eastern Front to the West, and they were able to, and these guys are getting tired in the trenches, Janet. They've been here for a long time. They're getting tired. If they had beaten the British and the French, what guarantee do you have you're going to get that $11.5 billion back? What guarantee you got from the Germans? No, you're going to send the collection squad, doughboys and Marines. That's, to me, it's the money. That's the main reason we're going to get into this. And this is going to be one of the cornerstones of American foreign policy from here on out. And are we going to get all that money back? Well, no, but we're going to get some of it back, because we're going to invest in Germany in the 1920s, because the Germans are going to owe, because of the Versailles Treaty, $33 billion to the Allies. How are they going to pay that with a busted economy? They're not going to be able to really pay it until we invest in Germany. And then as they pay back the Allies begin to pay back us. It works in the 1920s, but that's to me, it's unrestricted submarine warfare, some of the reasons you're saying, but in the end, it's the money. Follow the money.
Okay.
The dollar is coming on as the world's reserve currency. And this is one of the big reasons it will become that, and the pound will be ousted. Interesting what's going on here. It's absolutely fascinating. It truly is.
Thank you, Mark. So Mario is next, followed by Norma. Mario, please unmute yourself.
Hello, Mario.
Okay.
Oh, apologies. I'm really sorry. I thought Norma was going before me. So I'm having
good
issues
day.
with. Good day. Thank you. I learned a lot even as a history teacher. And I'm having trouble with my device, so I missed a lot of it. I hope to hear the whole presentation soon. I'd like to know when it's going to be posted, and as well as in terms of the role of the Soviet Union when Palestine was partitioned. And do you think that might be a condition of the ends justifying the means? And perhaps if you'd like to also talk on the tangent of the role of China. I know China has verbally today supported the rights of Palestine, but in terms of getting aid to the Palestinian people and actually confronting Zionism, perhaps there's also a lack of Marxist resolve. So can you talk on that? Thanks.
Yeah, I like your idea here. When Roosevelt made that deal on Valentine's Day, 1945, oil is what won the Great War in the end. The United States and the Soviet Union are awash in it. They're taking a bath in it. The Germans, the Japanese, and Italians had to go get it. It's not an accident they lose the war. It's not an accident at all. However, when it's over, even though Roosevelt is dying here, he understands that one of us is going to have to take control of oil, not in his own space, but in other spaces. So who better to do that, Washington or Moscow, looking at it from an American perspective? It's Washington, right? So he makes the deal. However, once Israel is formed, guess what? Golda Meir will become the first real ambassador for this new state of Israel. And guess which country she's going to, Mario? She's going to Russia. She's going to the Soviet Union. She was petitioned to go there, and she actually gets the first Israeli passport in this sort of instance here, and she goes there, and obviously Stalin wants to get into the Middle East, perhaps through Israel. Now, is it going to happen? No, but he gives it a shot. He actually gives it a shot. But the Soviets are really going to focus on supporting a lot of the Arab states. If you remember, he supported Iraq at one point. He supported Egypt at one point. Of course, after the 73 war, Sadat's going to dump them and then go with the United States. That's why we give them they give Egypt over $2 billion every year. That's part of the deal here. But once the Soviet Union collapses in 91, and America for a short period of time enjoys that superpowerhood that makes it makes it a unipolar world for a short period of time, then it becomes a multipolar world. And obviously here, who's going to be the new competitor? It's obviously China. Now, if you remember the summer before, Iran and Saudi Arabia were beginning to try to form a rapprochement here to settle their differences. Because the Iranians now have been able to raise their stature here ever since Saddam Hussein was taken out, which the Saudis will never forgive us for, because Saddam was that bulwark to Iranian Shia fundamentalism. And now it's interesting. Now the Saudis are willing to make some sort of deal, and that means trying to solve the Yemen problem. However, who helped them make that rapprochement? China. You don't hear much about China here, but they helped. Now, why is that? Why are they able to do that? They are able to do something here that we couldn't do on our best day. China is Iran's biggest oil customer, and they're getting upwards of 26, depending on the time here, they're getting upwards of 26% of their oil from Saudi Arabia. They are able to make the deal. Why? Because they don't have that baggage we have. And that baggage here is not just a suitcase, Mario, it's a steamer trunk. It's called Israel. They don't have that baggage. So, and you understand here, if you watch China, They'll sell you tanks, maybe. They'll sell you, they'll build a bridge for you. They'll sell you some guns, perhaps, but they don't make a military alliance with you. We'll help you, but that's as far as it goes. They keep their nose clean here. At least they have thus far. Why? Because it works for them. You know how many countries, Mario, have signed on to the Belt and Road Initiative? 100. 100. So why do they need to go to war? That's not the United States way of doing things. That's not the US way of doing things.
Yeah, a lot to think about there. I really appreciate your analysis. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you for tuning in.
Great. So
Okay,
Norma is
gee.
next, followed by Sharon. So those are the next two. Norma, please go ahead.
Hi, Norma.
Hey, sweetheart, how you doing?
Your voice is very low, Norma. Get closer to the microphone, please.
Uh-oh.
Okay, you're fine now. You're fine now.
Oh, okay. The Jews were very fortunate in being so horribly, horribly brutalized for, well, centuries, really, to the point where they, and having that position be taken control of by people who were able to spread that information around very well, to create of that group, that is, the people who were made into Israel, settled on Palestine, that group of new country became sacrosanct, unable to be, I mean, raised to a level that you cannot reach. You cannot touch them with any kind of discussion about the situation, to the point where in this friend of mine, you know, Paul LaRudy, do people know Paul? He's a very active, was a Palestinian, now American. I wrote and asked him, I said, how come the people in 1946, the Jews, the boatload of Jews, did not just integrate into living on Palestine? And because, you know, the Jews had been living there for what, 100, 200 years among everybody else. And he said, well, because they didn't want to. And he cited Herzl's, and I guess I think the book was named Judenstaat. Jewish state. So
Right.
that's one thing we're living with, is the idea, and there was to be no non-Jews on Palestine. That was the commitment, and in case you haven't noticed, that's what's going on. In the meantime, my comment on Ukraine is that it invaded Russia, and people can look up the things that happened and decide whether or not that is in fact what they are able
Okay.
to agree with.
Okay,
Yeah, partly the Poles invaded Ukraine in 1919 too. And that
Okay.
Say that again.
The Poles invaded Ukraine in 1919, precipitating the Russo-Polish War, a war nobody talks about anymore. And as they're going east, they're slaughtering Jewish people by the bushel. Now's a chance to get rid of our Jewish problem. You had a comment, though, Norma, before about 1915.
Oh yeah, just that Lenin, you know, or the revolution took the USSR out of the war, because in order to be able to fund the things that they had to do in order to commit to a communist revolution.
Well, that really begins to start here in 1916, when, you know, with the Battle of Verdun on the Western Front, the French are screaming for help. And then, you know, in fact, in that 10-month battle, you're going to have 750,000 men as casualties here, for really no gain. Then they're screaming for help. So the British launched an attack up north on the trench line at the Somme River on July 1, 1916, and they lost 60,000 men in one day. It's still the record here for the British. Now they're both screaming for help. to Russia. You know, you've got to help us out. You've got to take some of the pressure off of us on the Western Front here. So the dutiful ally, the Tsarist Russia, will launch a huge offensive against the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but that will force the Germans to send troops to the Eastern Front. But in the summer, Norma, the summer of 1916, it cost the Austro-Hungarians 600,000 casualties. 600,000.
I can't
You know,
watch the
and
news.
you know what it cost the Russians? 1 million men.
The news is intolerable. I've gotten to the point, and I've watched it for a long time and tolerated a whole lot. I'm 88, and I was here when all of this was going on, and it's dry. I can't tolerate knowing anymore.
Yeah, but in 1916, after losing 1 million men in the summer of 1916, this is when many of those peasant soldiers figured, I've had enough. And so some of them shouldered their rifles or just dropped them and started to walk back to the farm. And now the emperor has no clothes. And so by February 1917, we move ahead and the revolution starts here in Petrograd. And among the first in the streets, which is forgotten by many people, women. Women. Yeah. Yeah.
Speaking of that, now we have Sharon Rose next, followed by Eleazar Friedman. Sharon, go ahead.
Thank you, Mark, for that sweep of history. I was going to start with where Janet started. So I thank you, Janet, for adding that. And I just wanted to continue that a little bit, and also off of Mario's question around the role of the Soviet Union in the partition of Palestine, which I think was a huge mistake. We should teach our children, our students, about what happened in the immediate aftermath of the war, of the Second World War, and the U.S. role in causing the partition of Palestine and the Nakba. You know, the Holocaust Museum, which is getting more and more popular for high school to go to. In New York has now decided that 8th graders are going to go to Washington en masse, I guess, according to the New York Times. That museum, it says that the United States took in hundreds of thousands of Jewish refugees from Europe after the war. Yes, exactly 250,000. Now, there were about, it's hard to say, but there were about 3 million remnants of European Jewry left. Now, many of them lived in the Soviet Union, and I have not been able to figure out exactly how many were in the West, but it was a lot more than 250,000. And those poor people were given very little choice. So their choice was to stay in their original home. A lot of them were Polish and other Western people. And coming out of the concentration camps, they just couldn't deal with that. They just couldn't deal with, the ones who were healthy enough, they couldn't deal with staying in Poland or wherever. And they were offered an alternative. The Zionists sent guides, come with us, we'll essentially walk and ride down to the Mediterranean and get on boats. And that's what they did. Not necessarily in large part, not necessarily because they were Zionists. They just wanted to get out of there, and the U.S. wasn't taking them.
Right.
You had to be sponsored by an American family, American person, to even get on the list to immigrate to the United States.
Yeah.
So I think that
even back then, Aaron, you had people in this country who were not fans of Jewish people.
Well, yes, of course. Yes, but I think the main thing was that the U.S. wanted to bolster the immigration into Palestine.
Well, yeah, so they don't come here.
Well, yes, but also because the United States was beginning to see Israel, the Jewish state, the potential Jewish state as a Western outpost,
Which,
colonial outpost.
bouncing off what you're saying here, you know, we are playing, even after 48, we are playing, the United States government is playing both sides of the fence, which is why in 1950, you know what the Seven Sisters are going to do? The oil companies that are in bed with Saudi Arabia, they are going to make a deal here. You know, they're going to make it a 50-50 split in the oil profits. That'll keep their mouths shut about what? Israel, the imperialist satrapy for the United States. And interesting how they do this, Sharon, and Truman's going to go along with this.
Oh, yeah.
Truman's going to go along. They're not so interesting. They are going to report this. They're going to report their income as a tax to the host state, Saudi Arabia, so they don't have to pay the taxes to the IRS. So what you're seeing here is a corporate foreign policy, and that means elected officials do not get control of the money. What is it James Madison said? The bankers control the money? No, Congress is to control the purse.
I just wanted to add, thank you, Mark. I just wanted to add one other thing, and that is that when we're talking about what's happening right now and the growth of the BDS and the growth of the pro-Palestine movement that we've seen, that has just been amazing, just amazing to those of us who've been trying to talk about Palestine for many years. I think we should put it in the broad sweep of history and say that the only way that US foreign policy ever gets changed in a radical way is in the streets. And that's historically the case. And it's now the best bet we have is continuing to build this movement.
I just finished teaching a course called Vietnam Struggle for Unification. And that's the same tact I took with the Tet Offensive, after the Tet Offensive, when Nixon sent the troops into Cambodia. Once that became known, millions of people were in the street. And so what did Congress tell Nixon to do? Get out. Now, why did Congress tell him to get out? Because the people, it's the pavement parliament that worked, not the elected parliament that worked.
Yeah, people always refer to, well, what's the opinion of the Arab street? And sometimes that's a put down, that's a kind of a racist put down. But we should talk about the American street.
Well,
it's a reality.
I remember my father telling me when I was a kid, my father was a World War II Navy veteran. And he told me, he says, when people don't control the street, they don't control the voting booth.
Thank you, Mark. I want to move forward. Sharon, you can come back, but let me go to Elazar if you're it's okay.
Oh yeah, go right ahead.
Okay, Elazar, please go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, Elazar, how are you?
Fine. How are you? I enjoyed your wide sweeping talk. I don't know if I could keep up with it. I have a very simple question.
Sure.
In 1953, I was at Yeshiva University Library, and I read a 2-volume history of British Zionism, and the introduction was written by Sir Mark Sykes. And he openly said an introduction to the effect that Israel would be our Ulster in the Levant in the Middle East. And I have been unable to find any references. I believe it was written by Shapiro, but it was strictly on British Zionism in 2 volumes. And I've found Balfour easily online, but I can't find this intro by Sir Mark Sykes. I even wrote the Mark Sykes Library, and I even called Yeshiva University. They don't have it listed. So I just thought maybe you could do some research on this. And I also want you to clarify why the Soviet Union not only recognized the partition of Palestine, but of India, which was much more costly in lives even than the partition of Palestine. Thank you.
Yeah, Stalin is the consummate gamesman. In fact, I'll go on record as saying he was one of the greatest backroom politicians of the entire 20th century. He really was. And he agrees to that partition mainly along the same lines that Zhou Enlai will agree to the partition of Vietnam in 1954-55 with the Geneva Accords, and Ho Chi Minh's going to say the Chinese sold us out. That's what Ho Chi Minh's going to say. However, having said that, Stalin, you're seeing that breakup of India here, and that part of that, Elazar, goes back to what you saw before the end of the First World War, when you actually had a disagreement of opinion in the British Foreign Office. There were those in London in the Foreign Office who wanted to do away with the caliphate in Anatolia, while at the same time there were those people in the Foreign Office in India who did not want to get away with the caliphate because they thought it would make their job more difficult with the Muslims rising up in India. They didn't want that baggage. This is that argument that was going back and forth on how we monitor Anatolia once we break it up. However, having said that, Stalin's looking at the same thing. Now, keep in mind, most of the Muslims here in Pakistan are what? Sunnis. Most of the Muslims in Russia are what? Sunnis. That's why when you add to this, remember when Putin went into Syria 2015, 16, 17 to keep Assad on the seat? Why did he do that? Because of the fact Assad is a Shia leader. We want a Shia leader here, not a Sunni leader. And guess who's going to back him up here? China's going to back him up because most of the Muslims they got are Sunni. They're afraid that if the Sunnis can take the seat from Assad here in Syria, it might give them a little motivation to try to maybe separatist movements in both Russia and China. That's how Stalin sees this. He thinks he's playing that game of trying to split. He doesn't want a united India here. He wants a split India. Okay, Pakistan. Let's do that. And Zhou Enlai is going to say the same sort of thing about Vietnam in 55. We agree to the split. Why? Because they know so the Soviet Union is going to try to foster a united Vietnam as a client state. That means they're stuck between Russia, the Soviet Union, and Vietnam, and they don't want it. So split it. Interesting how big powers look at things, whether they're communist, whether they're so-called democracy. What matters here? Nationalism and foreign policy. That's what matters here. Gee, people are predictable, aren't they?
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Elazar. And so it's my turn. So, yeah, first of all, on Elazar's comment about Stalin accepting India's partition, let me say that the history of India that I know is it was not possible to prevent it. The movement had grown enormously but partitioning of India began much earlier by the British when the opposition started in the United States of Bengal. So they divided Bengal into east and west along the religious lines, and that sowed the seed of partition. And there was, this, they exploited the conflict. They actually enhanced the conflict, the British, between Muslims and Hindus in order to keep control. I don't think it was up to Stalin. It was not under Stalin's power to change it by the time it occurred. So that's on that. But I wanted to point out something here, a comment and then a question to Mark. And the comment is that old imperialism was about land and grabbing resources.
Right.
And in that sense, the modern imperialism that Lenin defines is similar, but there's a difference. This is under capitalism. So the dynamics is different. And what the dynamics of capitalism is that it must keep on producing profit and enlarging itself. So this gets out of the control of even the capitalist. And then the finance develops out of this accumulation, which becomes so powerful that it begins to constrain even the productive sector. So those dynamics are taking place now. And one of the reasons for rise of China is precisely because more surplus could very fast, in a very faster manner, could be generated in China thanks to Chinese Communist Party organizing production in a countrywide. So my question, so what I'm saying is the nationalism that you talk about in the nation state, modern nation state is a capitalist formation. In other words, this is a territory under which capitalism develops. And today, this nationalism has once again become a very strong force, including that in China, by the way. So, and certainly in India. Okay. So my question to you is, given all that is happening, and you say it's a multipolar situation, how do you see in that context the situation of Israel? Because the United States is, in my view, a declining but powerful imperialist power. But now these new forces have arisen, and with China and Russia being a militarily very strong, and China being economically strong, this combination and the national liberation has been the history of the 20th century. And this state of Israel is a anachronism to that. It's out of another period of history. So how do you see this moving forward, given this combination? Any comments on that would be welcome.
Yeah, it's a good one, because you're talking about capitalism. In fact, I think a couple of my students that I had in the spring were still on here listening to this, and they've heard me say that the modern religion, especially in this country, is capitalism. That's man's secular religion. It supersedes Catholicism, Protestantism, Judaism, and Islam, because in their present states, they can't exist without what? Capitalism. And sometimes when I'm pushed on it, I'll tell people in certain talks that Washington, D.C. is the nominal capital. The real capital of the country is only 40 miles south of me. It's called Wall Street. They control the money. They control the money. Having said that, what you're talking about here, and I find this fascinating because immediately as you're talking, I'm thinking of an historical parallel here, is what Halford Mackinder warned the British about at the end of the 19th century going into the 20th, that Russia, no matter what form Russia is, it's a supermarket of resources. It's the most resource endowed country in the world. It's part of Eurasia. That's the supermarket. And he warned London, you can't let this monolithic German corporate state form an alliance with Tsarist Russia. You can't allow that. It'll be the end of the British Empire. Well, what are you seeing now here, Raj? China and Russia? And so why do you think, and so, I mean, I don't think enough Americans think of this. Why do you think we're working in Ukraine here? Because the CIA would like nothing better than to dismember the Russian Federation. Now, why would they want to do that? That's the supermarket. That's the supermarket. And Mackinder stated, whoever controls, mind you, Eurasia, then goes south. He calls that heartland. Whoever goes into rimland, the Middle East, right? Especially in the modern sense, oil and gas. Then get yourself into Africa. Africa's another place crawling with resources. The Congo, anybody remember the Congo here? If you can control that, guess what? You control the globe. You control the, I mean, there are 1 million people living in China and living in Africa, 1 million Chinese living in Africa. Do you honestly think there's 1 million Americans living in Africa? No, no, they're not. And so the game, as you state, is still being played here. Is capitalism that major feature of this? Yes, because if you can get the resources, if you can control the resources, that leads to what? Financial domination. Remember when the pound was the world's reserve currency? The dollar is the world's reserve currency. How long that's going to last, Raj? I don't know. It's not going to end today. It's not going to end tomorrow. It's not going to end next week, next month, maybe not even next year. But it's going to end someday. Why? Because man made it that way. And whenever man does something like this, what happens to it in the end? And then somebody else comes along. We start the process all over again. Then when they've had their time, they collapse. You know, I call it this is my theory on history, horizontal determinism. Take a look, and it works over the centuries. If you take a look at an empire, at a society, at a culture, at a military power, they all have their high points, and then what happens to them? They fall apart. Someone else comes along. But man, in the end, in this regard, always fails. You can bet the house on it. He can't maintain the continuity. He can't.
Yeah, the world is constantly changing. And so thank you, Mark. Richard Wright in the second round is first. Go ahead, Richard.
Hello again, Richard.
Again. Actually, you just sort of anticipated what I was going to ask you about. I wanted to sort of modify it a little bit. You mentioned that the modern resource that has driven well, the modern drive for is capitalism. I would amend that to not say capitalism per se, but the search for money, finances. That basically that there has been a shift from the search for resources. Not to say that that's gone away, but there's also been the same things happening on the financial sector, and I think you're seeing a split in the dynamics of capitalism, if you will. That and I'll let you I'll riff off of that for a second, if you would. Thank you.
Yeah, well, you know something, Richard, you're seeing a change in resources. If you remember when Nancy Pelosi was still Speaker of the House, and remember when she went to China?
Right.
Now, you think that was a social call? I mean, she went to Taiwan. You think that's a social call? No, it's not. Because Taiwan supplies the Department of Defense with 53% of its computer chips. And what is she telling them? Why don't you move some of your production or even all of it to the United States? Now, that goes along with Biden's Build Back Better program. Remember that noise about turning Ohio into a mecca for producing computer chips? When years ago, it used to be one of the leading states in automobile production and parts. Remember Firestone Tire in Akron, Ohio? Okay, how do you think China felt about that? Not too well. And so that's what she's doing. Computer chips. Years ago, that's not a resource. Today it is. That's changing. That's changing. But money, financial domination is still part of the game. And thus far, it hasn't gone away. Thus far, it hasn't gone away. And so, but now, having said that, you are seeing more and more countries getting on that de-dollarization. It provides the United States with too much power. That is the engine of growth here. The dollar. It is. Take the dollar away. What's going to happen to the United States if the dollar is no longer the world's reserve currency? Who's going to pay off the debt?
We are.
Yeah, there's a prescription for a revolution, huh?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I agree.
You're going to have to sell off the state parks, the national parks. You're going to see more and more parking meters become privatized, you know, and what's going to happen to health care and so on and so forth.
Okay.
Interesting.
Yeah. Well,
Okay. Great. So we have Mehmet followed by Richard. Please, Mehmet, go ahead.
Hello, Mehmet.
Mark, thank you. Hi, thank you very much for a great presentation. I'd like to go back to the Lausanne Treaty. It was very interesting that, as you said, there was in the plan, there was no Turkish state or Ottomans left in Anatolia originally, but then something happened, which was the creation of the Soviet Union. A revolution happened. So that's why they had to go to a bumper state that needed to be a buffer state, that needed to be in between. And of course, this boded well with the Soviets as well, because they were expecting an invasion from the West, and the West was expecting Bolshevism to spread from the East. So that's why Turkey had to be created, and it was created by Mustafa Kemal, who was actually in very good terms with the British. So although today the Turks say that they have given an independence war, there was no independence war. It never happened. It never occurred. What the Turks were in favor of was an ethnic cleansing of the new Turkey. They had started this with the Armenian genocide. They had started with the exchange with the Greeks. And so they had to finalize it when the British gave the go-ahead for Greeks to attack Anatolia. That was the only war, if you can call it that. I call it a skirmish, to get the Greeks out of Anatolia. But in this new modern Turkey, the creation was against the East. That was the mentality. Turkey in one night decided to become Western, and so they had to abandon the entire East. And when we come to today, it's very interesting that Erdogan going against this and trying to bring the Ottomanism back is by his Islamic roots, let me say, is supporting Palestine. But different than 1970s is that the progressives, not the communists, the socialists, but the enlightened Kemalists now have chosen Palestine as the enemy. It's a very strange twist of events, because they believe that in this independence war, the Arabs took the side of the imperialists with the British and knifed us in the back. So now the Turks see them as the agents of imperialism, and people are, maybe they are not with Israel, but they are not supporting the Palestinian cause, just because they equate that with the Islamism of Erdogan, going back to the Arabs, which we have abandoned as being the Eastern mindset. Now we are Western, so let's turn our back upon the Palestinians, who are getting what they deserve for hitting us in the back. So that was an interesting twist of events, I think.
Yeah, it's interesting what you're saying here, because as far as the Greeks going, getting a piece of Anatolia on the western coast of Anatolia, that was also pushed by the United States, based off the Wilson's 14 points. You know, the Armenia, yes, the Poland is named here in the 14 points. And so people will be able to determine their own fate. Well, but what you're seeing in Anatolia is a 20th century crusade. That's what you're seeing here. And there's that term again. Remember when Bush used it? Yeah, that was intelligent to use that term. But having said that, And so these Muslim Turks are not going to allow that. They're not going to allow that. And so, and another thing that's happening here too, this is 18, 19, 19, 20, 21, 22. The British need to maintain their empire, but after 4 years in the trenches, those families want their boys home.
Mm.
If this had been 1914, it might have been different, but it's 19, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22. Those families want those boys home. And after this cataclysmic conflict, it is now to the point where the British wanted to use Australian and New Zealand troops in Anatolia. And what are the Australians and New Zealanders telling them? No, we've had enough. We're going home. If that's not an outward sign of that decline of the British Empire, nothing is. Nothing is. So there's a lot of pieces in the machinery, in this factory working here. A lot of pieces of machinery working here as the change in the globe is happening. It's one step after another, and you actually need a scorecard to keep up with it. You really
let me say two things there. One of my grandfathers who fought in the war said that the first people that the British brought that were fighting on the side of the Greeks were Muslims. I'm assuming that they could be from Pakistan or I don't know, one of their colonies. So soon both sides understood that they did not want to really have this fight. So they would stand up and shout to the other side, Muslim, boom, boom. They would shout. So they would be firing their guns to the sky instead of each other. But then the British understood this trick, and so they have to pull back the Muslims and bring the Australians, to fight for them. The second thing is that Mustafa Kemal has written many places that he said, independence is in my DNA, is in my biology. That's me. But then not too many people mention him going to the British and telling them, quote, saying, you know how to rule a colony. When you go to colonize someplace, you pick somebody who knows the land, who knows the people very well, and you make him the colonial governor. Let me tell you, I know Anatolia, I know Ottomans, I know the land very well. So, you know what to do. So that wasn't taken seriously at that time, before during the war. But then when Turkey was needed, guess who became the leader of that country? So that says something.
Yeah, the George Washington of Turkey, as some people call him.
They think, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Interesting.
All right. So we'll go to Richard and then be followed by Karen. Richard.
Hello, Richard.
Hi, Mark. I really appreciated your talk, but I'd like to raise the question. There's a sort of underlying theme in your talk of sort of eternal recurrence. The players change, but the game remains the same.
Basically, yeah. But
I disagree, well, at least I want to raise the question. The left Marxists generally think that the Soviet Union, the revolution in the Soviet Union and then in China, ushered in a new form of social organization. That is a progression in social organization, so that those countries were not the same as the old imperialists. And sort of an example of that is the question of Armenia. The Turks massacred the Armenians, whereas the Soviets set up an Armenian republic for the Armenians in the Soviet Union and for the other ethnic groups in the Soviet Union. They went to great lengths to set up, autonomy within this multi-ethnic society, and the Chinese do the same. And now the the Russian Federation continues that tradition. So, I think it's important to recognize that there is not, obviously these countries have to play to a certain extent on the imperial battlefield, but they want to destroy that battlefield. They're not trying to just set themselves up as the next imperial superpower. So, that's my contention, anyway. You obviously have a different one, and well, I'll leave it at that, and other people can chime in if they want.
Well, the thing with the Armenians was the Armenians in Anatolia were got to be hooked up with the Armenians in the Caucasus. This is especially true after the Russians lost the Caucasus, and Lenin wants it back. And so Ataturk's going to make a deal with him. He took care of the Armenian Republic in his neck of the woods, and Lenin's going to do the same thing in his neck of the woods, and then proclaim that what's going to be the Armenia SSR. So in other words, the Armenians are going to be changing one overseer for another, and that's where this is going to go. That's where this is going to go. And Armenia won't become an independent state. I mean, a truly independent state until what? After the collapse of the Soviet Union?
Mm-hmm.
So, so the saga goes on here. The saga goes on here. But I mean, it's interesting how man continues to play this game. He can't seem to get off this merry-go-round, no matter who it is. No matter who. I mean, when the founders found this country, do you honestly think they're just going to sit here with 13 states? Supposing the British want to come back, supposing the French want to come back, supposing the Spanish want to come back. Let's put it together now when the only enemy here to really speak of is the Indian. Does the Indian have artillery? No. Does the Indian have a navy? No. Going to get rid of them. And that's in fact, in that manner, I mean, and I've said this at other talks, at other places. I said when you take a look at this, manifest destiny, Zionism, Lebensraum, Dragnak Osten, Haku Ichu, things like this are really not much different. The basic premise is the same. You take the land from your fellow man and you take control of it for whatever reason you subscribe to. That doesn't seem to change.
Okay, so before I let Karen go, Karen, you will definitely get a chance, but since I want to comment on this exchange between Richard and Mark, what I want to say is, you remember, Lenin had gave all the nations in Russia the right to secede. So I think, Mark, I also disagree with respectfully with your thesis that nothing changes. So in that sense, I think what Richard is saying, the rise of socialism is quite different. In fact, I do not know the splitting of Armenia, but I do know that many, certainly several states were given power. And although Stalin persuaded them that you're better off staying in the Union, he said, we have two roles to play. One is to give them the right to secede. The other is to argue that your survival from imperialism depends on us hanging together. And he gave the nationalities greater power together, combined, okay, over the Russian nationality. So I think what Richard is saying is something, as a Marxist, I believe that is a correct interpretation. And it differs from your thing that man continuously wants to dominate. It doesn't change with the system. I think that's what I want to say on this.
In fact,
go ahead, comment on that, and Karen will go next.
In fact, I'm just finishing up a piece right now. I have a column that I do every month for Army Aviation Magazine online. It's called Looking Back. And in fact, I have I have a column in the print magazine, and I've been doing that column for, God, 12 years. I do the occasional feature in the print magazine, but I like really doing the online magazine because there's no advertisement. I can go on from here. I come here till the cows come home. And it's based on the 80th anniversary of Normandy. Now, my take on Normandy is these guys just didn't risk life and limb on that beach, on the beaches on June 6, 1944, to serve Hitler as eviction notice from France and the Low Countries. Why? You going to trust Stalin to stop at Berlin and Prague? You're not gonna. You're not gonna. And so Stalin, when the war, in fact, Stalin said, because Averell Harriman, you know, was giving kudos to the Soviets for beating they're the ones that beat the German army. He also said, I want to congratulate the Soviet people for this great victory. I want to congratulate the Soviet army for this great victory over the and I want to congratulate you for your leadership. And you know what Stalin said? Tsar Alexander got to Paris. So, but however, he also says, and he's right, a country or a leader will spread their influence as far as their army can reach. It can be no other way. That's Joe Stalin. That's the Soviet Union after he's done with it. That's an empire. And so these people are not going to be independent. They are going to toe the line. Why? Because Joe says so. Let me tell you something. If I was writing a dictionary, and I always tell people, I understand why some people are always interested in Hitler. He's a fascinating character. I'll give you that. But I always tell people, boy, you're missing something by not knowing Stalin. You really are. He is one of the most fascinating leaders of the entire 20th century. He really is. There's a lot going on here with this guy. There really is. He's a fascinating character to get to know.
I agree with you. I don't agree with the Stalin wanting influence is different than building an empire. But let's go to Karen, because I don't want to be the last one to ask. Karen has been waiting patiently. Karen,
Hello,
please.
Karen.
Okay, hello everyone. This has been fascinating. I love this topic. I've been attending or live streaming the conference on Palestine in Detroit. I don't know if you know about it, but there are like over 1,000 people there with speakers talking about the student movement and how to rebuild, the role of the media. But none of them are giving any kind of class analysis of Fatah or Hamas. They talk a lot about the resistance and praising it without really critically presenting what's behind it. And I think, you know, we have a great responsibility to teach younger people, because this is a theme throughout the student protest about nationalism and national liberation and the failures of national liberations, and that instead we should organize for communism and talk about that as the alternative to nationalist struggles. And I'm a member of Progressive Labor Party, and that's been our line for many, many years. And I just wonder what people's take is on that. How do we combat the nationalism in these movements and steer people in a different direction?
You know, I was giving this talk along these lines a week ago at a place in Darien called the Mather Center. And I go there every month. And I got into the, because someone said, well, Hamas is a terrorist group. I said, so? I said, what do you think the Sons of Liberty were in 1765, 1770, 1774? Well, they were a group of patriots. I said, yeah, patriots. I said they were terrorists. That's what they were. And I said, that's not a condemnation. That's an observation. And I said, when you want to, if you're trying to throw off what you think is oppression, if you want to win, you win. And I said, there's a book written by Crane Brinton, The Anatomy of Revolution. If you're interested in revolution, it's a book you should read. And he talked about an incident that happened not far from where I live in New Milford, Connecticut, when in 1776, a bunch of patriotic colonists found out they had a Tory in their midst on his farm, and they went there at gunpoint. You know what they did? They took this Tory and they marched him up to Litchfield. If you're not familiar with Connecticut, that's a beautiful ride up Route 202. I have clients up there I give talks to. It's a beautiful ride, but not walking it at gunpoint. And when they got to Litchfield, 20 miles they walked this guy. They had him stripped down naked. He had to carry a goose from his farm, and he had to pluck the goose. Then they hit him with a bat of hot tar and then hit him with the feathers. Now, what would you call that? Terrorism? Torture? So we were doing this here long before Persians said they were Iranians. Everybody does it. You want to win, you win.
But it depends upon what you want to win.
Correct.
And I think Hamas is a very wealthy, fundamentalist organization that wants to take control. They are not protecting the working class. They're not building a working class revolution at all. And, you know, I'd rather follow John Brown. You know, I don't call him a terrorist because, you know, he was fighting with the working class as much as he could, and he was fighting for liberation from enslavement. So I think the content is really important.
Yeah, but where I work in Army Aviation Magazine, I make sure and I've said this up there. I said there is no such thing as this man's guerrilla as this man's terrorist and vice versa. All guerrilla groups use terrorism. It's a poor man's weapon. He has used it, does use it. He will always use it. Always. Why? Because you're against a monolithic enemy. I can't afford fighter planes. I can't afford sophisticated missiles. I can't afford tanks, but I can afford to make your life miserable by making you uncomfortable here.
Well, the South African liberation fighters blew up railroads. You know, they went to the point of production. That's fine. I mean, I think you have to minimize the assaults on people, on the civilians and the regular people in your, you know, where you're fighting. I don't support things that are called terror. And I just want to answer Janet. I base a lot of this on, like, Amira Haas wrote a book called Drinking the Sea at Gaza, which was about how Israel converted a jihad group into Hamas to counter the more socialist and liberal views of the PLO. And there's also a book that I just got called Hamas Contained, which is a critique of it. I haven't read it yet, but I'm really looking forward to that. But there's a lot out there about Hamas, and you can find out what they're worth, how they taxed Palestinian Gazan workers 60% of their wages when they came from their Israeli workplace to Gaza. You know, there are a lot of examples about how they ran things just like any capitalist would run things, except they provided a lot of social services, and you can't knock them for that.
Okay, at this point, I have to interject because our time is up. Karen, thank you very much. We are going to in future have a robust discussion on nationalism. I happen to agree with Mark. National liberation is fought with any weapons and by a combination of classes. That's the first thing you have to overthrow oppression. Then it's a different thing. So we can choose for Palestinians who are their leaders. They are in a struggle. Right now, Hamas is fighting. We have to, in my opinion, they are the national liberation of Palestinians at the moment. Anyway, we'll have a discussion on it. Mark, thank you very much. And everybody, will see you a week from now. And great session, Mark. Very exciting.
I put my email addresses in the chat. So if you folks want to carry on the conversation afterwards, or you forgot something to bring up, send me an email or whatever. I'll answer it.
Yeah, you can copy by going to those 3 dots in the chat. And if you hit the 3 dots, one of them will say at the top it says Save Chat, which I'm doing right now, and then it will appear in your email if you don't know this. I think most people here know it.
Yeah,
Okay.
Raj, that really sort of depends on what you're watching this on.
Okay.
I mean,
I'm on Zoom.
yeah, I understand. Well, I understand Zoom.
Yeah.
Zoom has different ways of doing this depending
Okay,
on.
there are different versions of Zoom,
Yeah,
is what you're
exactly.
saying. Okay. All right. So on my laptop, that's how it works, but it may not work the same way on the phone.
I can't find those. Oh, there's those 3 dots.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so we'll see you next week. Norma, have you saved the check? Can I go ahead and
No, don't turn it off yet. I haven't. I tried those 3 dots, but it's not working. Hold on. Copy. Okay, I got it.
Okay. All right, Mark, once again, thank you. And everybody, thank you for coming.
Thank you for the invite.
for the
Appreciate it.
discussion. Yes. Great. We'll see you soon.
Thank you, Mark.
Yeah, have yourselves a wonderful afternoon, huh?
Thank you, Mark. It was great. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Colossal sweep of history.
Thank you, Kenmore. See you soon.
Thank you.
All right.
Take care now,
Bye.
folks.
Bye. I'm closing this session. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye now.
Institute for the Critical Study of Society at the Nebel Proctor Marxist Library receives no corporate funding, nor do we have any paid staff. We rely on the support of working class folks that share our commitment to the socialist legacy of Karl Marx. We continue to need funds to meet necessary expenses. Since we can no longer pass the hat at our in-person forums, please send contributions to our treasurer, either online via PayPal or by check. The PayPal ID is ICSS Sunday, SUNDAY, at yahoo.com, and the name is Richard Fallenbaum. And checks may be made out to Richard Fallenbaum and sent to him at 1225 Nielsen Street, Berkeley, California, 94706. Fallenbaum is spelled Fallenbaum. To donate directly to the Marxist Library, send a check to the Nebel Proctor Marxist Library at 6501 Telegraph Avenue, Oakland, California, 94609, or directly or donate online at www.paypal.me/npml. For information, write to npml at marxistlibr.org, and the website is marxistlibr.org.